10 years, Wesley. 10 years, and you still come in through the service door. Corinne Braddock's voice carried across 300 people in the grand ballroom of the Peninsula Chicago. Pitched exactly loud enough to be overheard, the way it always was. He promised me an empire once. You all know what he built? A name nobody bothers to say out loud. Wesley Ardelan didn't answer. 37 years old, charcoal suit with no statement in it, a glass of ice water he hadn't touched all night, 10 years divorced from this woman, and he'd never once raised his voice to her. He wasn't going to start tonight. Say something, she pressed, playing to the room now. Tell 300 people what you've made of yourself. Somebody laughed, and Corinne reached over to a passing tray, picked up a plate of cake, and threw it at his chest. He tilted his head 4 inches. Not a flinch. Just 4 inches the way a man moves when he's had a lot of practice not being where people expect him to be. The frosting hit the silk wall behind him and slid down slow. Nobody breathed. Wesley didn't wipe his lapel, didn't look down, didn't raise his voice a single degree. He just looked at her and said quietly, "You just did that in front of 7 men you really shouldn't have done that in front of." Corinne laughed. 7 who? 7 ghosts in your head? He didn't answer. He turned his head and across that ballroom, 7 men set their glasses down on 7 tables, half a second apart. 7 small sounds of crystal touching wood, and 300 of the wealthiest people in Chicago went silent, not because they understood what they'd just seen, because something older than manners felt it. Here's what Corinne didn't know. The man she'd just thrown a plate at hadn't spent 10 years failing. He'd spent 10 years disappearing. She thought she was humiliating her broke ex-husband in front of 300 witnesses. She was doing it in front of 300 witnesses to the most dangerous man in Illinois. His grandmother used to say it at the kitchen table of a walk-up on Belmont Avenue, in that heavy Romanian accent of hers. Wesley, they shout about what you lost. They whisper about what you have. Learn to hear the whisper. Corinne never learned. She was about to. And she wasn't the only one in that ballroom who'd guessed wrong about Wesley Ardelan that night. 4 feet behind him stood a woman holding a tray, wearing a name tag that just said Surter. Hers was the guess that changed everything. Now let's go back, because to understand that ballroom, you have to understand what happened 4.5 months before it. 4.5 months before that night, in the grand ballroom of the Peninsula Hotel. At 5:47 in the morning, Delia Rourke sat on the kitchen floor of her 3rd-floor apartment in Bridgeport and counted loose change from a Danish cookie tin. The blue tin had been in her home since she was 7 years old, one corner of its lid dented, the inside still clinging to a sheet of yellowed paper lining. She counted by arranging the quarters into stacks of 4, because when she counted that way, her hands didn't shake. 9 stacks, then 8 dimes, 11 nickels, and a handful of pennies she didn't bother sorting. Together with the $20 bill folded into quarters inside her wallet, she had $340 left to live on until the end of the month. She wrote the number on the back of an electric bill with a ballpoint pen, so dry she had to trace over it 3 times, then fixed it to the refrigerator door with a pineapple-shaped magnet. She always put the number there, not to remind herself, so she wouldn't have to think about it again until the end of the month. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a walk-up building on 37th Street, 2 blocks west of St. Barbara Church, and every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday morning, Delia walked down 64 steps, then climbed all 64 of them again so she could help her mother come down. Ruth Ann Rourke, fragile and weighing just 112 pounds, hadn't been able to make it down the stairs by herself since April. She gripped the banister with her left hand and her daughter's forearm with her right, and every 7 or 8 steps, she stopped to catch her breath. At the 31st step, where a window looked out over the laundromat parking lot, she always said the same thing. "I'm sorry, sweetheart." Delia always gave her the same answer. "Mom, please stop apologizing." Then they kept going. The 2009 Toyota Corolla was parked at the corner, its hood marked by a patch of mismatched paint, where Delia had repaired it herself the year before, and the gear shift made a dry cracking sound every time she put it into second. She drove 14 minutes along Archer Avenue to the dialysis center, wedged between a Polish bakery and a sporting goods store that had been closed since summer. Ruth Ann's session began at 6:30, 4 hours. Delia didn't sit in the waiting room because the waiting room had a television, and television made her sleepy, and she couldn't afford to be sleepy. She sat in the car instead, The driver's seat reclined exactly 1 notch and slept for 3 hours and 40 minutes, with her alarm set 20 minutes early so she could go inside in time to help her mother back out. Ruth Ann always apologized a second time in the parking lot. Delia always answered exactly as she had before. Afterward, she took her mother home, cooked oatmeal, placed 2 pills on a paper napkin beside a glass of water, and left for work. She had 3 jobs. From 11 in the morning until 6 in the evening, she worked at a warehouse near Pershing Road, scanning labels and stacking boxes on pallets. And she was good at it because she was fast and didn't talk. Starting at 8 in the evening, she put on a white shirt, tied a black bow tie around her collar, and carried trays for Pemberton and Vale Catering in hotels whose names appeared on other people's wedding invitations. Night shifts paid more. Night shifts also meant she came home at 2 in the morning and woke again at 5. On the nights she worked these late catering shifts, she paid her neighbor, Mrs. Gable, $10 to stay with her mother until dawn, ensuring she was never left alone. On weekends, she cleaned offices for an accounting firm in a building on Wacker Drive. 3 floors, 6 hours, and she always left people's desks exactly as she had found them, even the coffee cups they had forgotten. Between all 3 jobs, she earned more money than she needed to keep herself alive, and less money than she needed to keep her mother alive. The distance between those 2 numbers was $900 a month, and Delia knew it was exactly 900 because she had calculated it so many times that the number no longer frightened her. It was only a number. It was there. That morning, when she closed the lid of the cookie tin and pushed it into the cabinet beneath the sink, the sun hadn't risen yet, and beyond the kitchen window, a garbage truck was backing up, its steady beeping echoing through the narrow alley between 2 rows of brick buildings. Delia stood and listened to it for a moment. She was 27 years old. She didn't cry in the mornings, because in the mornings she needed steady hands to help her mother down 64 steps, and she had learned long ago that tears made a person's hands shake. At 11:40 on Saturday night that week, Delia was carrying a tray on her 9th circuit around the small ballroom on the 2nd floor of the Drake Hotel in the Gold Coast, during a private party whose purpose she neither knew nor needed to know. About 80 guests, champagne, trays of cold appetizers, and a piano in the corner, playing songs no one was listening to. She had worked 19 hours out of the past 24. She had $23 in her wallet, and she was calculating in her head whether taking an extra Sunday morning shift would be enough to cover the $360 shortfall she faced that month. She passed a group of 4 men standing near the window, and one of them, a silver-haired man with a flushed face and an empty wine glass in his hand, reached out and seized her wrist. He didn't touch it, he seized it. Then he yanked her sharply toward him so he could take a glass from the tray, and the tray tilted, and 3 glasses of champagne slid off, spilling over his sleeve and shattering on the wooden floor. The room turned to look. The man released her wrist and began to shout. He shouted that she had no idea how much that suit cost. He shouted that she knew what she had been hired to do. He shouted that he wanted to hear her apologize right now, loudly enough for everyone to hear. Delia stood still with the tilted tray in her hand and 5 red marks still pressed into the skin of her wrist. She said nothing. The event manager arrived 7 seconds later, a woman with her hair pinned into a high bun, whom Delia had worked beside for 4 months and had never spoken to for more than 3 sentences at a time, and the woman studied the situation for 2 seconds before doing what anyone in her position would have done. She turned to Delia and said, in a voice just quiet enough to sound like a professional instruction, that she should apologize to him, not because the woman was cruel, because that was how the matter could end in 10 seconds instead of 10 minutes, because the catering company's contract depended on events like this, because 80 people were watching, and because in that entire room, the cheapest person to sacrifice was the one wearing a name badge with no name on it. Delia understood that. She had understood it for a long time. She set the tray down on a side table, turned toward the silver-haired man and said, "I am sorry, sir." Then she bowed her head. A real bow, not a nod, about 40 degrees, deep enough for her hair to fall forward and cover her face for 1 second. He gave a contemptuous sniff, turned away, and resumed the conversation he had been having with his 3 friends. The piano kept playing. Someone laughed. Within 20 seconds, the room had completely forgotten what had happened, and Delia picked up her tray, continued walking, and that was the whole of it. No one noticed that in the corner of the room, near the column to the left of the stage, a man stood alone with a glass of water in his hand, a glass he had been holding all evening without taking a drink, and that he had watched everything from beginning to end. He didn't step forward. He didn't call anyone over. He only watched, and when Delia lowered her head, he didn't look away as the others in the room had done. He watched until it was over. Then he placed the glass of water on the ledge of the column, stepped into the hallway for about 4 minutes, and returned. 15 minutes later, when Delia was arranging dirty glasses inside a bin at the side table beside the kitchen door, the silver-haired man approached her. He was alone. His face was deathly pale, not the pallor of a drunken man, the pallor of someone who had just been told something. 4 employees were standing in that area. Kestrel Doyle had just stepped out of the kitchen, and the silver-haired man straightened his posture, looked at Delia, and said that he owed her an apology. He spoke slowly and clearly, loudly enough for all 4 of them to hear. He said that he had been wrong, that the fault had been his, and that he never should have put his hands on her that way. Then he added one more sentence. He said he hoped this wouldn't have any effect on her job. Then he left. No one said a word. Kestrel looked at Delia. Delia watched the man's back as he walked toward the door. Not one of the 4 people standing there understood what had just happened, Delia included, and it would take her 4.5 months to understand. At 1 o'clock in the morning, in the loading area behind the Drake Hotel, the steel door stood partly open onto the alley, between the building and the parking lot, and Delia sat on an overturned empty beer crate with her back against the brick wall, still warm from the kitchen ventilation duct. She had removed her black bow tie and tucked it into her apron pocket. 5 red marks were still fading across her wrist. She wasn't crying. She simply sat there, staring at a puddle beside a storm drain, where the distorted reflection of a sign across the street trembled on the surface, and she wasn't thinking about anything at all, which was the only thing she allowed herself to do during the 15 minutes she had between shifts. The steel door made a sound. The man with the glass of water stepped outside, holding an unopened pack of cigarettes, and he stopped about 3 paces from her, resting one shoulder against the wall, while turning the pack over in his palm, as though searching for a place to tear it open. He didn't open it. He had no lighter in his hand. He merely stood there with the unopened pack, and Delia understood at once that he didn't smoke, and she also understood that he wasn't trying very hard to hide it. He didn't ask whether she was all right. That was the first thing she noticed, and it made her lift her eyes to him. Everyone asked that question. Kestrel had asked it. The event manager, had she bothered to ask, would asked it too. The question always meant, "Tell me you're fine so I can move on." He didn't ask. He looked out into the alley and said, "What time does your shift end?" Delia said 2 o'clock. He nodded once, as though working through a small calculation, then said, "Then you have 1 hour when you don't have to be the server." She didn't understand the sentence immediately. It came to her slowly, over the course of about 3 seconds. And when it did, something inside her chest dropped by 1 degree, not because she was moved, but because it felt as though a piece of exhaustion had finally been set down. She asked whether he had just told her she had an hour-long break. He said no. He said she had 1 hour to be anyone else. Then he sat on a second beer crate about 3 feet away from her, and they talked. They talked for exactly 1 hour. She didn't ask his name. He didn't ask hers, and the badge pinned to her shirt offered him no help, and perhaps that was why. They spoke about things that belonged to no one. She told him about a stray cat that had lived in the basement of her building when she was 10. A cat with only 3 legs that everyone in the neighborhood fed, but no one adopted, and it lived for 9 years. He told her about a winter when he had worked at a construction site, and the entire crew had been forced to stand around for 4 hours, because one identification number was missing from the paperwork. And during those 4 hours, a man had taught him how to tie a particular knot that he still used to this day. He didn't tell her what he did now. She didn't ask. At one point, she said she preferred night shifts to day shifts because people looked at one another's faces less at night, and he went silent for about 5 seconds before saying that was why he preferred the night too. It was the truest thing either of them said that evening, and they both knew it, and they both let it pass. At 5 minutes before 2, Delia stood, brushed off her sleeves, and said she had to go back inside. He nodded. She went in. She finished the final 20 minutes of her shift, returned her apron, signed the logbook, and when she stepped out through the employee entrance on Walton Street at 2:20, he was still standing beneath the streetlight at the corner, with the unopened pack of cigarettes in his hand. She stopped. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything else. He gently took her hand, and without words, they walked together to the quiet sanctuary of his room. What happened afterward happened slowly, soberly, and without a single promise between them, and they both knew exactly what it was and what it wasn't. The next morning, when Delia opened her eyes at 7:10 in the unfamiliar warmth of his bed, he was gone. There was no note, no telephone number, nothing at all. She lay still for a while in that unfamiliar room, where the quiet of the morning felt suddenly heavy, staring at the ceiling, and she thought that this was right, that this was exactly the kind of thing people should have for one night and then leave behind, and she believed it almost completely. Then she sat up, and on the bedside table, beside the hotel alarm clock, there was a Zippo lighter. Its steel case was scratched dull across one side, its hinge loose, the kind of lighter someone had carried in his hand for nearly 30 years. Delia picked it up. It was heavier than she expected. On the back, engraved by hand and slightly crooked, were two initials, Y and A. That lighter had been in another man's pocket before it came into Delia's hands, and that man died in the federal prison at Terre Haute, Indiana, on a February afternoon when his son was 19 years old. Yannick Ardelan died of heart failure in the medical unit, with no one beside him, after serving 9 years of a 14-year sentence. Wesley received the call at 4 o'clock in the afternoon while standing on scaffolding in Logan Square. He asked for 2 days off. He drove 3.5 hours down to Indiana to sign the papers, drove 3.5 hours back, and returned to work on Wednesday morning. Everything his father left behind fit inside a manila envelope: a broken wristwatch, $41, a Zippo lighter he had carried since before Wesley was born, and a last name. The last name was the most valuable thing in that envelope, in the sense that it carried the greatest weight, and it was also the only thing Wesley couldn't throw away. He discovered that for the first time when he was 20, after walking into a bank branch on Milwaukee Avenue to apply for a $4,000 loan to buy a used pickup truck. He had pay stubs. He had an employment contract. He had a thin credit history, but it was perfectly clean. The loan officer typed his name into the computer, and then she stopped typing, and Wesley saw the exact moment her face changed. She didn't say anything rude. She was entirely professional. She said his application required further review, and that they would contact him, and they never did. He tried another bank in Portage Park, then a credit union in Jefferson Park, then a place on Irving Park Road, 4 times in 14 months, and every time there was that same moment, the moment when a stranger typed 12 characters into a keyboard and then stopped. No one ever said the reason aloud. No one needed to. From the age of 19 to 23, Wesley Ardelan worked construction during the day and attended night classes 4 evenings a week at a community college on the Northwest Side. Studying construction management, he poured concrete, built forms, pulled cable, and did any work someone would pay him to do. He didn't drink on the job site. He didn't accept undocumented cash. He kept every receipt in a shoebox beneath his bed, even receipts for bread, because from the age of 19, he had told himself that if the day ever came when someone looked into his life, they wouldn't find a single place where they could lay a hand. He was clean to an almost unreasonable degree. He was clean in the way only the child of a prisoner could be, not out of morality, but out of fear. He lived with his grandmother in a second-floor apartment in Avondale on Belmont Avenue, in Chicago's Romanian neighborhood, where there was an Orthodox church 3 blocks away, a bakery that sold Kozenak during the holidays, and 3 cafes where middle-aged men sat from morning until afternoon, speaking a language Wesley understood but didn't speak well. Ilona Ardelan came to America when she was 26 and never learned to drive. She worked in a garment factory for 41 years. Her kitchen had a round wooden table, worn smooth at one corner, because she always sat in the same place, and Wesley always sat across from her, and that was where she told him the sentence he would remember for the rest of his life. In her heavy English, she said that in this country, people didn't ask what you did. They asked what your father did. She didn't say it to comfort him. She said it the way someone might report the weather. Wesley asked her what he was supposed to do about it. She shrugged and said she didn't know. She had never figured it out, and she had already lived through so much of this world. He never forgot that answer. It was more honest than any advice he had ever heard. When Wesley was 22, he was hired as an assistant superintendent at a small construction company on Grand Avenue. The owner, an Irishman named Mulvaney, knew exactly who his father was and hired him anyway, and, in 3 years, he never mentioned it once. Wesley worked for him as though every day were his last. He arrived 45 minutes early. He stayed late. He learned the names of all 40 men on the crew, including those who remained for only 2 weeks. He was 23 years old. He had no money. There wasn't a single line in his record that could make anyone raise an eyebrow. And he believed, with all the certainty of a man who had never yet been tested, that if he kept doing everything right for long enough, then eventually the name on his papers would become nothing more than a name. He met Corinne Holloway in the autumn of the year he was 23, at a museum fundraiser that Mulvaney's company had been invited to because they had just completed the renovation of the main lobby, and Wesley attended only because his boss told him to. She was 27, tall, quick to smile, and she spoke with him for 15 minutes without asking even once what he did for a living, and he misunderstood that completely. He thought it was kindness. It took him 4 years to understand that she hadn't asked because she already knew, and because to her, the answer mattered less than the fact that he didn't know she knew. The Holloway family lived in Winnetka, in an 8-bedroom house overlooking the lake, and that house had already been mortgaged twice by the time Wesley first stepped inside it. Her father had lost 3 companies in 6 years. No one in Winnetka knew. That was the earliest lesson Wesley learned about that world, and the one he remembered longest, that bankruptcy on the North Shore wasn't an event but a secret, and people could preserve it for 10 years simply by never lowering their voices. They married the following June. Ilona attended, sitting in the second row, wearing the same suit she had worn for 40 years to every wedding and every funeral, and she shook hands with Mr. and Mrs. Holloway and said nothing throughout the entire reception. And on the way home, she made only one observation, that Corinne had the eyes of someone who was always watching the door. Wesley thought his grandmother was simply being difficult. After marrying at 23, they spent 4 years together. He worked 3 jobs during those 4 years. By day, he worked for Mulvaney's company. 3 evenings a week, he took subcontracting jobs repairing homes for people he knew, and during the summers, he accepted roofing work as well. He told no one about it. Corinne didn't hide the fact that he worked in construction, but she had a way of speaking about it that made anyone listening understand that it was only a phase, that she was waiting for something else to come along. She wanted to earn a financial analyst certification, a 3-level program, and the first level cost $4,200 including materials and examination fees, and they didn't have $4,200. Wesley went to 4 more banks. The same moment, the same 12 characters, the same promise that they would contact him. He didn't tell her about those 4 banks. He went to a pawn shop on Belmont Avenue, 4 blocks from his grandmother's apartment, and sold Ilona's wedding ring. She had given it to him 2 years earlier, wrapped in a piece of felt, and she had told him it was his, and he could do whatever he wished with it. It brought $3,800. He added $400 of his own money and paid Corinne's tuition, and he told her he had picked up another subcontracting job. Ilona knew. She knew within 9 days, because the pawn shop belonged to the son of a woman she knew from church, and in Avondale, nothing traveled farther than 3 blocks. She didn't call him. She waited until Sunday, when he came for lunch as he did every Sunday, and she waited until he had finished eating, and then she sat in her usual worn place at the round wooden table and didn't scold him once. She asked him only one question. She said, "You make more money than your father did. Can you make more silence than he did?" Wesley didn't understand that sentence when he was 24. He thought she was talking about keeping the sale of the ring secret. He said, "Yes, I'm sorry," and she waved one hand as though an apology were the most useless thing on the table, then poured him more tea, and they never mentioned it again until the day she died. When he was 25, he learned about Preston Braddock. He didn't learn by catching them together. He learned the way most men learn, by gathering things so small that each one could be explained on its own until their sum could not. A name appearing too often in stories about work. One fixed Thursday evening, the way she placed her phone face down on the table without realizing she had done it. Wesley didn't ask her. He didn't ask a single question, not once, during the 2 years that followed. He told himself he didn't ask because he wasn't certain yet, but the truth was simpler and far worse. He didn't ask because he was afraid the answer would end everything before he had finished proving himself. At 25, he still believed this was a problem of time and effort, that if he did enough, earned enough, endured long enough, then one day she would look back, finally see him and choose him, and all those years would become a story they told other people. He took a 4th job. He slept 4 hours a night. And he waited 1 more year, and then came an October evening, when he was 26, that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Corinne had an industry networking event at McCormick Place that began at 6 o'clock, and she said it would be over by 8. Her car was in the garage. Wesley said he would pick her up. He finished work at the construction site at 5:30, and there wasn't enough time to go home and change, so he went straight there in his work pants and a canvas jacket still dusted with cement across the shoulders. He arrived at 7:40. It began to rain at 7:50. He could have waited in the car. That was the first thing people would later ask him. Had he ever told anyone the story? And he never had a decent answer to that question. He had parked in an underground garage 4 minutes away on foot, and he stood outside the north entrance, beneath an overhang less than 3 feet wide, because he was afraid that if she came out and didn't see him immediately, she would have to wait, and he didn't want her to have to wait. 8 o'clock passed, then 8:30. At 8:40, he sent her a message containing only 3 words, "I'm outside." She read it. 9 o'clock. The rain shifted from drizzle into real rain, the kind of October rain in Chicago that traveled sideways instead of falling down, and after 15 minutes, that 3-foot overhang protected nothing at all. A canvas jacket soaked with water became 3 times heavier and 10 times colder. His shoes had filled with water by 9:10. He didn't send another message. He stood there for 3 hours. A security guard came outside twice and looked at him, and the second time he asked whether Wesley needed anything, and Wesley said he was waiting for his wife, and the guard nodded and went back inside. At 10:45, the glass doors opened, and Corinne stepped out with 5 or 6 people, all of them laughing, all of them dry, and she was saying something that made the man walking to her left throw his head back in laughter. She saw Wesley immediately. Wesley took 1 step toward her. He didn't raise his hand. He merely stepped forward once and stopped, water streaming from the hem of his jacket onto the concrete, and he looked at her, and she looked at him, and during that 1.5 seconds, something crossed her face that he saw with perfect clarity, and would spend the next 11 years trying to forget. Then she turned back to her group and continued the conversation she had been having. She spoke 2 more sentences. Someone laughed again. Wesley stood 3 paces away from them in the rain, and not one of those 6 people asked who he was, because Corinne didn't introduce him, and when a person wasn't introduced, he became part of the furniture. The conversation continued for another 4 minutes. He knew it was 4 minutes because he watched the digital clock on the lobby wall through the glass. When the group finally dispersed, Corinne walked toward him. She didn't apologize for making him wait 3 hours. She didn't ask how long he had been standing there. She stopped about 3 feet from him and frowned very slightly, the kind of frown people used when they noticed a stain on a tablecloth, and she said, "Could you step back a little? You're soaking wet." Wesley stepped back once. She didn't say it cruelly. That was what remained inside him the longest, even longer than the words themselves. She said it the way someone stated an obvious fact to a person around whom there was no need to be careful. She opened her umbrella and walked ahead toward the parking garage, and he followed 4 paces behind her the entire way, and she never looked back. He opened the car door for her. He drove them home. For 40 minutes on the highway, his clothes were soaked through, the leather seat beneath him was soaked through, and the windows fogged completely from the steam rising off his own body, forcing him to wipe the glass 3 times with his sleeve. Corinne fell asleep in the passenger seat. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't say a single word. When they reached home, he opened the car door for her. She went inside, and the hallway light came on, then went dark. Wesley didn't follow her. He remained in the car in the garage driveway, his hand still resting on the steering wheel, and he didn't start the engine, and he didn't turn it off, because it was already off. He sat there for 20 minutes. Water dripped from his hair onto his thighs, 1 drop at a time. He didn't cry. He didn't strike the steering wheel. He couldn't think of a single sentence to say to anyone, not even to himself. And that was precisely the problem, that during those 20 minutes, no anger came to save him. There was only a vast, level silence, and at the center of it was one thought, clear, calm, and completely wrong, that he still wasn't enough. Then he got out of the car, went inside, hung the wet jacket on a hook, and said nothing. He remained not enough for another 11 months, and then in September of the year he was 27, Corinne left. There was no argument. That was the part Wesley never told anyone later, that he had spent 2 years preparing for a fight, and in the end, there was no fight at all. She packed her belongings into 2 suitcases on a Tuesday afternoon. He stood in the bedroom doorway and watched her do it, and she folded her clothes very carefully, one piece at a time, as though she were packing for a business trip. She took nothing that belonged to the house. She left the wedding photographs in their box. At the door, she said her lawyer would be in touch, and she thanked him, and Wesley never managed to understand what those 2 words meant. Then she left. She didn't look back. He stood at the window and watched her car turn the corner, and he was still waiting for that anger to come, and it still didn't. The divorce papers were finalized within 4 months. She asked for nothing because there was nothing to ask for. 11 months after the papers were signed, Corinne Holloway married Preston Braddock in a ceremony in Lake Forest that Wesley read about in the newspaper's wedding section, 3 lines and a photograph. He read it on a Saturday morning, folded the newspaper, and went to work. But even before that wedding, in November of the year of his divorce, his mother collapsed in the kitchen of her apartment in Portage Park. Marta Ardelan was 58 years old. She had lived alone since the day her husband went to Terre Haute, had worked as a supermarket cashier for 19 years, and had never had her heart examined once in her life because she had no time and because she believed she was healthy. The doctor at the hospital said she needed heart valve surgery and a bypass, that they could schedule it within 6 weeks, and that the procedure would cost $300,000. The supermarket's insurance would cover 40%. Wesley needed $180,000. He had $14,000 in savings and a pickup truck that wasn't yet paid off. He went looking for a loan. He did it exactly the way he had been taught. For 27 years was the right way, which meant he brought documents, stood in lines, filled out applications, and sat across from kind people in rooms with artificial plants. He visited 9 lending institutions in 19 days. He carried his employment contract, 3 years of pay records, a handwritten letter of recommendation from Mulvaney, and a spotless credit history without a single mark against it. He explained that the money was for his mother. Some of them were genuinely sorry. One woman at a branch on Cicero Avenue truly tried, calling her supervisor twice while he sat in front of her. But at a certain point in every conversation, someone would type 12 characters into a keyboard, and that moment would return, the moment he had known by heart since he was 20. Ardelan. No one rejected him because he was poor. Had they rejected him for being poor, he could have done something about it. They rejected him because of his father, a man who had been dead for 8 years, a man whose body Wesley had driven 3.5 hours to claim, and then driven 3.5 hours back so he could return to work. On the 20th day, a welder at the construction site gave him a telephone number. The man said nothing more, only wrote it on the back of a materials slip, pushed it across the lunch table, and told him the decision was his. The man in South Chicago received him in an office behind a scrap metal yard on 106th Street. He was around 60 years old. He didn't ask for paperwork. He didn't ask about Wesley's credit history. He didn't ask who his father was. And it was the first time in 8 years that someone hadn't asked. And Wesley remembered feeling something almost like gratitude when he realized it, and he would despise that gratitude for the rest of his life. The man asked how much he needed. Wesley said $180,000. The man asked when. Wesley said 6 weeks. The man nodded and said it could be done, then added one more sentence, that Wesley wouldn't be repaying him with money, and he knew that, didn't he? Wesley knew. He had known before he ever walked into that room. He said yes. The surgery took place in January, lasted 9 hours, and was successful. Marta woke up. She held his hand in the recovery room and asked where the money had come from, and he told her the insurance had covered more than they expected, and she believed him because she had always believed him. She went home after 11 days. She began walking around the block again. She started cooking again. 3 months after the surgery, on an April morning, Marta Ardelan died from a blood clot, a complication, something that had nothing to do with the heart that had been repaired and was beating normally. The funeral was held at St. Adalbert Cemetery. The weather was dry. Wesley stood there in a black suit, not yet 30, owing a man in South Chicago $180,000 that he would repay with the remaining years of his life, and he had become the very thing he had spent his entire youth trying to prove he wasn't, while the person he had done it to save lay in the ground before him. Ilona stood beside him, leaning on a cane, and she said nothing. Neither did he. Years after that funeral, no one in Illinois typed his name into a computer and stopped anymore, because by then, they already knew before he entered the room. Wesley repaid the $180,000 debt in 2 years and 7 months, and he repaid it by doing things he never spoke about afterward, and when the debt was finally gone, the old man in South Chicago asked whether he wanted to stop, and Wesley said no, that was the real choice. Not the night at the scrap metal yard. That night he had no choice at all. The night he said no, 3 years later, when he owed nothing and could have returned to Mulvaney's construction sites. That was the night he chose, and he understood that clearly, and he never lied to himself about it even once. He was good at it. That was the most unsettling part. He was good at it in exactly the same way he had once been good at building forms and reading blueprints, through precision, through a strong memory, through arriving 45 minutes early and remembering everyone's name. Within 4 years, he went from being the man who borrowed money to the man who lent it. 4 years after that, he no longer lent money. He owned the things other people needed to borrow money just to approach. Ardelan Holdings was founded when he was 32, and on paper, it was a transportation, construction, and real estate company. And on paper, that was true, because Wesley Ardelan didn't build a front. He built a real company with 400 employees who had health insurance, a human resources department, and a truck yard in Cicero, and he allowed the other part to remain beneath it, the way a foundation remained beneath a house. The two couldn't be separated. He never tried to separate them. Calumet Harbor took 6 years from him. No one in Chicago understood why a logistics company would be so patient with an aging dock district the city had neglected since the 1990s, and that was precisely why he succeeded, because during those 6 years, no one saw any reason to ask. Hollis Vance came to him in the 5th year. 43 years old, once a contract attorney at a firm on LaSalle Street, until he lost his license over something he never explained and Wesley never asked about. Hollis was the only person in the organization permitted to say anything he wanted to Wesley. One evening, around the 8th year, when Wesley rejected a deal that was entirely profitable simply because the other side had ties to the Holloway family in Winnetka, Hollis set down his glass and said, "You don't hate her." Wesley didn't answer. Hollis continued, "You hate the man who stood outside in the rain." It was the only sentence in 10 years that made Wesley leave the room. There was one rule he had made for himself after his mother's funeral, and he had never broken it. Don't touch people who have nothing. Not because of kindness. Because he had once been a man with nothing, and he knew exactly what it felt like to watch someone type 12 characters into a keyboard and stop. And he had decided that if his life had to become this, then at least it wouldn't become that. The people in his organization knew the rule. They didn't understand it. They obeyed it because it was his rule, and because in 10 years, no one had ever seen him repeat himself a second time. Ilona died when he was 30, at the age of 92, in the second-floor apartment on Belmont Avenue, and he sat beside her bed through her final 3 nights she knew. She never said aloud that she knew, but she knew, and one night she held his hand and said his name, only his name, with nothing attached to it, and that was the last time in his life anyone called him by that name in that way. After her, people called him Mr. Ardelan, people called him Sir, people called him many things, and none of them were his name. He never corrected anyone. By the age of 37, Wesley Ardelan owned 3 houses and slept in only one of them, an entire office floor overlooking the river on Wacker Drive, and a life that, seen from the outside, appeared to contain absolutely nothing at all. He didn't attend parties. He didn't appear in newspapers. He signed charitable checks through an intermediary foundation that didn't bear his name, regularly, every quarter, and he never read the board lists of any organization he funded, because reading them would have meant caring, and he had stopped caring long ago about whose name appeared on what. 3 weeks before the night in the grand ballroom of the Peninsula Hotel, Hollis Vance entered that office at 9 o'clock in the morning and placed a sheet of paper on Wesley's desk. Wesley was expecting a set of contracts. He looked down. It wasn't a contract. It was a receipt from a pawn shop. The receipt was a slightly crooked photocopy printed from the internal system of a pawn shop on 47th Street, and on it was a line describing the merchandise, typed by someone who didn't care what they were entering. Zippo lighter, steel case, used, engraved. Beneath that, in the notes box, were 2 initials written by hand in ballpoint ink. Y.A. Wesley looked at it for about 4 seconds, then asked Hollis where he had gotten it. Hollis said that 4.5 months ago, right after Wesley realized he had left his father's lighter behind at the hotel, Hollis had quietly placed a flag with every pawn shop and database in the city for that specific engraved lighter, knowing how much Wesley treasured it. Since Wesley had strictly forbidden anyone from tracking down Delia directly at the time, Hollis had simply waited for the item to surface. Wesley didn't say anything. He remembered the quiet anger he felt at himself for losing it, and how he had secretly hoped she would keep it. He had lost the lighter 4.5 months earlier, and he knew exactly where he had lost it, but he had purposely avoided searching for it himself. Afraid of what finding her would mean for his structured cold world, tracing it took 4 hours. The pawn shop had cameras and a ledger, and the ledger had a name and an address because Illinois law required it. Delia Rourke, 27 years old, 37th Street, Bridgeport. She entered the shop on a Thursday afternoon at 3:15. She brought 3 items with her: a thin 14-karat gold chain, a pair of earrings, and the lighter. The owner valued the chain at $140, the earrings at $60, and the lighter at $8, $208 in total. She needed $950. That was the number recorded in the file, and Hollis had matched it against something else, an invoice from the dialysis center on Archer Avenue. The uncovered portion of the cost for that quarter, exactly $950. She pawned all 3 items. She took the $208. She left the shop at 3:22, according to the camera timestamp. She returned at 4:02, 40 minutes. Hollis had found out where she had gone during those 40 minutes, and it hadn't been difficult. She went to her employer, a catering company called Pemberton and Vale, and asked for a $120 advance on her wages. Then she drove back to the pawn shop and redeemed exactly 1 item, not the chain, not the earrings. She left the gold chain and the earrings behind, and she paid $128 in fees and interest to recover a lighter that the same shop had just valued at $8, and she put it in her pocket and walked out. To her, the scratched steel was not just an object. It was the only physical proof that the warmest night of her life had actually happened, a small anchor keeping her soul from drowning in the freezing routine of her existence. After that, she was still $742 short on the dialysis bill. Wesley read the entire file twice. Then he sat in silence. Hollis stood on the other side of the desk for about a minute before saying, she lost $120 to keep an $8 lighter, and she still didn't have enough to pay the medical bill, which means that $120 was money she didn't have. Hollis waited. Then he said, "What do you want me to do with this?" Wesley didn't answer immediately. "Those 7 men at the tables," Hollis added quietly, "they didn't need to touch a single glass to make their point. Everyone in Chicago knows they answer only to you now." He was 37 years old, and he had spent 10 years making sure he was never in the position of not understanding something. Because in his line of work, failing to understand something was how people died, and he had become very good at recognizing other people's motives faster than they recognized them themselves. He could look at a man across a negotiating table for 4 minutes and know what he feared. But he didn't understand this. He tested every possible explanation in his mind, and none of them held. She didn't know whose lighter it was. She didn't know his name. She had no way of knowing what it was worth to anyone, because it was worth nothing to anyone. It was a scratched steel case that a prisoner had carried for 30 years, and a son had forgotten on a hotel nightstand. It wasn't an investment. It wasn't leverage. She hadn't kept it to bargain with anyone, because she didn't know there was anyone to bargain with. She had stood there, more than $700 short for her mother, and paid $128, She didn't have to recover a worthless object belonging to a man who had left without giving her a telephone number. Wesley remained in that office long after Hollis had gone. He didn't sleep that night, not because he was moved, because there was a fact lying on his desk that he couldn't process, and in 10 years, no fact had ever done that to him. The next morning, he called Hollis in and said only 2 words, "Find her." It took Hollis 6 days. He returned on Wednesday morning with a file thicker than Wesley had expected, and instead of sliding it across the desk as he always did, he set it down and kept his hand on it for 1 extra second, and Wesley noticed. Inside was an entire human life arranged in chronological order, and it was thin in the way the lives of people who had nothing were always thin. Delia Marie Rourke. Born in Bridgeport, father left when she was 4, attended Kelly High School, graduated with a grade point average of 3.9, 4 years working at a bakery and a warehouse. University of Illinois Chicago, nursing program, enrolled at 22, completed 2 years and 1 semester. Transcript almost entirely filled with A grades. Withdrew from the program in March 2 years earlier, never filed for a formal leave of absence, never responded to 3 letters from the registrar's office. She had packed her navy blue stethoscope into the bottom drawer of her dresser, a silent burial for a dream she could no longer afford. 3 current jobs. No credit debt because she had never been approved for a credit card. No criminal record, no lawsuits, no assets. Mother, Ruth Ann Rourke, 58 years old, end-stage kidney failure, dialysis 3 times a week, application for the transplant waiting list denied on the grounds of treatment non-compliance. Wesley read every page slowly. On page 11 was a copy of a medical record Hollis never should have been able to obtain, a routine ultrasound report from a community clinic on Halsted Street. Dated 11 days earlier, and in the upper right corner was a line of small printed text, gestational age, 18 weeks. Attached was a small personal note from her clinic intake form. She was keeping the child, choosing to carry the only warm memory of a night she had felt human into an otherwise freezing existence. Wesley said nothing. He didn't put the page down, and he didn't turn to the next one. He sat motionless, one hand still holding the edge of the paper, his eyes fixed on the same place, and he remained that way for about 40 seconds. Hollis stood across the desk without moving or speaking, because in 8 years of working together, he had never seen this man pause for more than 3 seconds over anything. Not bad news, not even very bad news, and he understood that he was standing before something he had no right to interrupt. 40 seconds passed. The clock on the wall made no sound. Beyond the glass, a barge moved slowly along the river. Then Wesley placed the paper flat on the desk, very carefully, smoothing it with 2 fingers until its edges aligned with the pages beneath it, and he asked exactly one question. Was she planning to tell me? Hollis looked at him. Then Hollis said, in the voice of the only person in the organization permitted to say anything at all, that she didn't know who he was. He continued, "How do you think she was supposed to find you? Knock on every door in the city." Wesley didn't answer. He showed no reaction, and Hollis had known beforehand that he wouldn't. And Hollis also knew that the sentence had just gone somewhere deep inside him and would remain there for a very long time. He turned to the last page and pointed at the work schedule. Delia Rourke had an evening shift that Saturday. Pemberton and Vale Catering, the annual Braddock Foundation fundraiser, the grand ballroom of the Peninsula Hotel on East Michigan Avenue, beginning at 7 o'clock. She was scheduled from 6 in the evening until 1 in the morning. Wesley looked at the name on the schedule, and it meant nothing to him. Braddock Foundation. It was one of roughly 90 organizations that received a check from his intermediary foundation every quarter, and he had never read a single line about any of them. 3 years earlier, he had signed authorization papers for an asset management firm on LaSalle Street, and they selected the portfolio, distributed the money, and sent him a report every January, and Wesley had never opened any of those reports beyond the first page. He didn't care whose name appeared on what. He had stopped caring about that when he was 28, standing in St. Adalbert Cemetery. When he understood that the name on a document didn't save anyone and didn't kill anyone, it merely determined whether people kept typing after the first 12 characters. He didn't read board lists. He never had. Had he read one, even once in those 3 years, he would have seen a name on the 4th line, and he wouldn't have gone there that Saturday night. Hollis asked whether he wanted him to arrange a meeting. Somewhere quiet. Wesley said no. Hollis asked what he intended to do instead. Wesley looked down at the file, at the ultrasound report lying flat among the other pages, and said he was going to go there and tell her that he knew. Hollis asked what would happen after that. Wesley had no answer, and it was the first time in 10 years that Hollis had witnessed such a thing. The silence lasted for about 4 seconds, and then the room did what rooms like that always did. It healed itself. Conversation returned first from the farthest tables, then spread toward the center. Then someone laughed, and within half a minute, 80% of the people there had decided that they had just witnessed an awkward private matter between two divorced people and nothing more. Corinne was still smiling. That was the most remarkable thing. She turned to the woman on her left and added another sentence. And she tapped one fingernail lightly against the rim of her glass. And she didn't understand. She truly didn't understand. And Wesley saw that and found that it made him feel nothing at all. He had stopped looking at her before the final piece of crystal touched the tabletop. He was scanning the room. He did it the way he did everything, systematically, beginning to the left of the kitchen door and moving counterclockwise, and he didn't look at anyone's face. He looked at their hands. In a room filled with 300 people wearing expensive clothes, 14 of them wore white shirts and black bow ties, and all 14 had been trained to disappear, which meant training other people's eyes to slide past them. And the only way to find one of them was not to look toward the place where a face should have been. He watched the way their hands held trays. He watched where each thumb rested, how many degrees each wrist tilted, how many fingers supported the bottom. 4.5 months earlier, in the loading area behind the Drake Hotel, he had sat exactly 3 feet from a woman for 60 minutes, and he had watched her hands throughout all 60 of them, because she spoke with her hands, and because looking at someone's hands was easier than looking at her face when both of them were trying not to be anyone at all. He remembered those hands more clearly than he remembered anything else about that night. He found them in 11 seconds. They were 4 paces behind him and to his right, and they weren't holding the tray correctly. They were gripping its edge, the knuckles white, and the tray was tilted by about 3 degrees without the person carrying it realizing. Wesley didn't turn all the way around. Delia had been standing there from the beginning. She had passed through that place at precisely the wrong moment, carrying a tray filled with empty glasses, and she had seen everything that had just happened from 4 paces away, and she had recognized him before Corinne even lifted the plate. She recognized him from behind, from the way he stood. She had remained motionless for nearly a minute, with a tray tilted 3 degrees in her hands, and during that minute she had passed through everything. She had heard his name. She had heard the other woman call him her former husband. She had heard the words about 10 years, about the empire, and about the name no one had bothered to say, and she had heard every one of those words fall onto him while he never moved. Then she saw the streak of frosting on his lapel. No one did anything. That was what made her move. 300 people in that room, and not one of them stepped forward, and those standing closest were turning away, and Delia knew exactly what that turned-away posture meant. She had watched it from the other side of rooms for 4 years. She had stood with her head bowed in the middle of it, one March night at the Drake Hotel, while 80 people decided that what was happening had nothing to do with them. She set the tray down on a side table. She took a folded white cloth from the edge of the tray, the cloth she carried to wipe the bases of glasses. Then she stepped between 2 guests blocking her path, forcing one of them to move back, and she walked 4 paces, and she stopped in front of Wesley Ardelan in the grand ballroom of the Peninsula Hotel. A 27-year-old woman wearing a name badge with no name on it, and she lifted her hand and wiped the frosting from his lapel. Her hand was shaking visibly. She wiped with short, neat downward strokes, following the exact technique they had taught her during the catering company's 2-hour training session, and she did it badly because her hand wouldn't obey her. She didn't look up at his face. She looked at the lapel. Wesley didn't move. He looked down at the crown of her head, at the trembling hand against his chest, and in 10 years no one had touched him without needing something, and he stood perfectly still, and he couldn't remember what he was supposed to do with his own 2 hands. Around them, the room began to fall silent for the second time. Corinne saw the cloth before she understood who was holding it, and her voice cut across the room the way it always had. "What are you doing? Get back to your place." Delia didn't turn around. That was the first thing that made all 300 people in the ballroom truly pay attention. Not the act of wiping the stain, but the fact that a server heard an order from the woman hosting the party and didn't turn around. Her hand was still shaking. She wiped twice more slowly, and then she spoke. She spoke very softly, softly enough for only one person. So softly that those standing more than 6.5 feet away would later say they had only seen her lips move. "You don't have to stand here." Wesley looked down at her. He hadn't looked at her during the entire minute before that. He had looked at the crown of her head and at her hand, and now she was lifting her face, and he looked directly at her for the first time in 4.5 months, and he spoke. He didn't lower his voice. He didn't try to lower it, and he didn't try to raise it either. He spoke at the normal volume of a man talking to someone standing 16 inches away, and in a room that had fallen silent for the second time, that volume was more than enough. "I came here to find you." Those 6 words traveled across the ballroom. Someone at table 9 dropped a fork. Delia stood frozen with the cloth still in her hand, and she didn't understand, and her face made it perfectly clear that she didn't understand. And Wesley saw that and offered no further explanation, because this wasn't the place to explain, and because in the 3 seconds before that, he had already known he had made a mistake that 10 years of training should have prevented. He had just allowed a person with nothing to become the person standing in the center. Corinne understood that before Delia did. She understood that something was happening here that she didn't control, and her response was the response of someone who had spent 30 years in rooms like this and knew exactly who in the room was cheapest to attack. She turned toward Delia. "This is the kind of woman you look for now. A little girl who carries plates." She said it with a smile, and she said it loudly enough, and 2 people nearby laughed with her because they thought they were allowed to. Delia didn't move. She had heard other versions of that sentence so many times that it no longer reached anything inside her, and that was what no one in the room understood, that the words didn't hurt her, they only made her tired. Wesley didn't raise his voice. He didn't step closer to Corinne. He didn't turn fully toward her. He only spoke in the same voice he had used all evening, a voice so level that people had to fall silent to hear it. "You just called her a little girl who carries plates." Corinne opened her mouth. He continued before she could speak. "Do you know who paid for this room, Corinne?" She laughed. She said, "Of course I know. This is my husband's foundation." Wesley didn't contradict her. He only said, "For the past 3 years, there has been a name on the checks that you never bothered to ask about. It says anonymous." Then he fell silent. He didn't say another word. He didn't mention the amount. He didn't name the intermediary foundation. Didn't name the management company on LaSalle Street. Didn't say that he had signed that authorization 3 years earlier, and had never opened any report beyond the first page, and that he himself had only learned about this roughly 40 seconds earlier, at the same moment she had, because he had never read the board list of anything. He left it there. The 300 people in that room filled in the rest for themselves, and they filled it in the worst possible way for Corinne Braddock, because that was how people always filled in what they didn't know. A whisper began somewhere near table 4. It spread. Someone looked down at the program card on the table, the card printed with a list of donors, and on the second line of the right-hand column, in 8-point italic type, was a word no one had bothered to read for 3 years. Corinne's face didn't turn pale. That was worth noting. It didn't go pale, it simply became still, the expression of someone who had just heard a sentence in a foreign language, understood only half of it, and was waiting for the rest before deciding how to react. For the first time that evening, she looked around the room not to perform for anyone. She looked for her husband. And Preston Braddock wasn't there. Preston Braddock had left the ballroom 4 minutes earlier, and he had done so in the most ordinary way possible, holding his phone, making the familiar motion of a man who had a call he needed to take. No one noticed. The only 3 people in the room who did were Wesley, who had seen him glance toward the door 3 times in 4 minutes, and had registered it without understanding why, and 2 men in dark suits who had been standing in the hallway outside since 7:15 that evening, drinking sparkling water and eating nothing. What happened in the hallway was seen by no one inside the ballroom, and it was very brief. One of the 2 men stepped forward, gave his name, showed a badge, and said a few sentences. The second man stood about 3 feet behind him and slightly to one side. No one raised his voice. There were no handcuffs. Preston Braddock looked down at the floor for about 2 seconds, then nodded, then handed his phone to one of the men, and all three walked toward the elevators. And the entire thing took 40 seconds and looked from a distance exactly like 3 businessmen stepping outside to discuss work. The ballroom doors opened at 9:51. The man who entered was 52 years old and wore a gray suit that didn't fit him particularly well. And he didn't look like someone doing anything important. He looked like an accountant arriving late to a party he hadn't wanted to attend. He walked directly to table 1, where 3 members of the board were seated, and he gave his name, Thaddeus Grieve, then named the agency he represented, and placed a stack of papers folded inside a blue cover on the table. He said that it was a search warrant for Braddock Meridian Capital, that the office on Wacker Drive was being searched at that very moment, and that he advised them not to leave the city during the coming week. He said all of it in the ordinary voice of a man reporting the weather. For about 6 seconds, the ballroom remained silent. Then a phone vibrated on table 7, then 2 more, then 10. Then the entire room began making a sound no one in Chicago had ever heard at a gala, the sound of 300 phones vibrating at once against wooden tables, because the news had gone online. And of the 300 people present that evening, roughly 90 had invested money with Braddock Meridian. The figure in the first report was $340 million. The phrase used in the second was Ponzi scheme. The final line of the third report said that according to the records, the fund had been insolvent for 14 months. Corinne didn't touch her phone. She stood in the middle of the room and looked around and saw 90 faces turn toward her at once. And in that moment she understood something it would take her many more months to understand completely, that over the past 4 years she had signed her name to 11 documents her husband placed in front of her, each time with a different pen, each time with the words "It's only a formality, sweetheart," and that in those 11 places she wasn't anyone's wife at all. She was a co-owner she hadn't known. That was the truth, and it wouldn't save her, because ignorance had never appeared on the list of acceptable defenses. Grieve gathered up the papers and left. He passed the place where Wesley was standing. He stopped. He looked at Wesley Ardelan for about 3 seconds, and during those 3 seconds the entire room watched him looking, and then he said 2 words, "Mr. Ardelan." Then he walked away. He said nothing more. He gave Wesley nothing, accepted nothing from him, didn't nod, didn't shake his hand. He merely spoke his name, walked through the door, and disappeared into the elevator. 300 people stood in the ballroom of the Peninsula Hotel and finished writing the story for themselves, and they wrote it in about 4 seconds, and every one of them wrote the same version. Wesley didn't correct them. He said nothing. He didn't say that he hadn't even known Preston Braddock would be inside this building that night. He didn't say that he had never met Thaddeus Grieve, that the man had been reading his name in case files for 4 years, and had never found a single line on which he could lay a hand, and that those 2 words hadn't been an expression of gratitude but a warning. He didn't say that he had come there that evening only because of an $8 lighter. He stood still and let the room believe whatever it wanted to believe, because in 10 years he had learned that silence wasn't something people left empty. It was something they filled for him, and it always carried more weight than anything he could have said himself. Corinne turned and looked at him, and this time her face went pale. She moved toward him, and she was no longer measuring her volume, and for the first time that evening, perhaps for the first time in 10 years, Corinne Braddock's voice came out without having been calculated in advance for any room at all. "You did this." The first time she said it, it was a question. Then she said it a second time, and it was no longer a question. "You did this to me." Wesley looked at her. There were many things he could have said in that moment, and he knew every one of them exactly, because he had carried them inside himself for 10 years, and had taken them out to examine more times than he wanted to admit. He could have said that he hadn't even known Preston Braddock was in the building. He could have named the 9 banks that had rejected him, when his mother needed $180,000, and he could have asked whether, during 4 years of marriage, she had ever once asked where he had found $4,200. He could have spoken about the ring. He could have said that she had just lost everything because of the man she had chosen over him, and that it wasn't justice, it was only arithmetic. He said none of those things. He said one sentence, and he said it in an ordinary voice, and in a ballroom that had fallen silent for the third time. Everyone standing close enough to hear did hear it. 11 years ago, you told me to step back because I was too wet. Corinne stopped. Wesley continued. I stepped back. Then he said the final sentence. I am still standing exactly where you told me to stand, Corinne. You are the one who walked away from it. She didn't understand immediately. She stood there for 3 seconds, and people could see her searching back through her memory, and they could see the exact moment she found it. An October evening 11 years earlier, an overhang less than 3 feet wide, outside the north entrance of McCormick Place, a 26-year-old man standing in the rain for 3 hours, with water streaming from the hem of his jacket onto the concrete, and a sentence she had spoken without thinking. A sentence she had forgotten before she even reached the parking garage, a sentence she hadn't remembered once in 11 years. She remembered it now. Her face did something none of the 300 people there had ever seen it do. It broke. She didn't cry. It simply broke somewhere around the mouth, and she raised one hand as though she meant to say something, and nothing came out. Wesley didn't wait. He turned away from her, and he never looked back at her again for the rest of his life. And he looked down at the woman standing 16 inches from him, with the white cloth still in her hand. He asked, "What time does your shift end?" Delia lifted her face. She had heard that question once before, at 1:00 in the morning in the loading area behind the Drake Hotel, when she had been sitting on an overturned beer crate with 5 red marks still pressed into her wrist, and a stranger holding an unopened pack of cigarettes had asked her those exact words. And she had answered 2:00. And he had told her that she had 1 hour, when she didn't have to be the server. She hadn't understood the sentence then. She understood it now. Her tears fell before she could do anything about them, and she didn't wipe them away, because her hand was holding the cloth and it didn't occur to her that she could use it, and she said, "Now." Wesley nodded once. He didn't take her hand. He didn't place a hand against her back. He simply turned and began walking toward the door, and Delia set the cloth down on the side table, placing it there very neatly, folded into quarters exactly as it had been when she took it out, and she followed him. 300 people moved aside. They moved without anyone telling them to. A man standing near the door stepped back twice, even though he didn't need to. No one said a word. In the corner of the room near the kitchen door, Maureen Pemberton, 44 years old, owner of the catering company, stood with the shift schedule in her hand and watched one of her employees abandon her shift midway through, walking through the center of the ballroom in a white shirt and black bow tie, and she said nothing. She didn't call the woman's name. She couldn't, because in 4 years she had never needed to know it, and now, standing there, she realized that she didn't. The ballroom doors closed behind them. Inside, 300 phones were still vibrating. The black car was waiting in the circular drive in front of the hotel, and a man Delia had never seen in her life opened the rear door for them, and she slid into the seat on the right, still wearing her white shirt, still wearing the name badge. The door closed, and the sound of Michigan Avenue disappeared completely, and in that silence she could hear her own heart. The car had traveled about 1 block when she asked, "Who are you?" She didn't ask in the voice of someone hoping to hear a beautiful story. She asked in the voice of someone who had spent 3 years sitting in hospital waiting rooms, and had learned that the only way to survive bad news was to hear it immediately, completely, all at once, instead of letting it drip into her life over 6 months. Wesley told her. He told her his name. He told her that his father had died in the federal prison at Terre Haute. He told her that when he was 27, he had owed a man in South Chicago $180,000 because not one bank in Illinois would lend him the money. And he told her that he had repaid the debt in 2 years and 7 months, and then he told her the part he could have left out. He said that when the debt was paid, they asked whether he wanted to stop, and he said no. He said his mother died 3 months after the operation. He said he had spent the following 10 years building something that, on paper, was a transportation and real estate company, with 400 employees who had health insurance, and beneath it was something else, and the two couldn't be separated. And he didn't try to separate them. He didn't use the word mafia. He didn't use any word borrowed from movies. He spoke in concrete nouns, street names, neighborhood names, numbers of years, and that was what made Delia feel cold. because liars used adjectives while people telling the truth used addresses. He didn't soften a single word. He didn't say that he handled only the clean side. He didn't say he had no choice, because he had already told her that the night he said no was the night he chose. He didn't apologize. He didn't promise anything. The car passed through 3 intersections while he spoke, and he didn't look at her once. He stared straight ahead, and when he was finished, he fell silent, and he didn't fill that silence with anything, and that was the only kindness he offered during the entire conversation. Delia sat motionless for a long time. Then she said, "I'm pregnant." Wesley said, "I know." He said it immediately, without even half a second of hesitation, and it was that speed that destroyed everything. Delia turned and looked at him for the first time since getting into the car. She said, "You knew before you came looking for me." Wesley said yes. He didn't explain the ultrasound report on page 11. He didn't say that he had sat motionless for 40 seconds when he read it, or that the only man permitted to say anything to him had stood across the desk and hadn't dared to breathe. He didn't say that he had searched for her because of a lighter, not because of the pregnancy, because saying that now would sound like an excuse, and it was an excuse, and he had lived 10 years without offering one. He only said yes. And within about 4 seconds, Delia understood the full shape of what had happened. Someone had read her medical records. Someone had known that she had lost $128 at the pawn shop. Someone had known that her mother received dialysis 3 times a week. Someone had known that she was $742 short. Someone had known that she was 18 weeks pregnant, before she had even managed to tell Kestrel, and that person had known all of it before walking into a ballroom and saying those quiet words, "I came here to find you," in front of 300 people. She had been read. Her entire life, the life whose name no one had ever bothered to ask, had been placed inside a file on the desk of a man she had slept with for one night, and whose name she hadn't asked because she believed it had been something shared between 2 strangers. It hadn't been something shared between 2 strangers. Only one of them had been a stranger. The car stopped at a red light on Michigan Avenue at the intersection with Ontario Street. Delia opened the door and stepped out. She did it without the slightest trace of drama. She didn't slam the door. She didn't say a word. She simply opened it, placed one foot on the wet pavement, stood, and pushed the door closed behind her, with only enough force to move it, then walked onto the sidewalk and turned left, a woman in a white shirt and black bow tie, among the Saturday night crowd on Michigan Avenue. And within about 4 seconds, she could no longer be distinguished from anyone else. The driver looked into the rearview mirror and waited for an order. Wesley said nothing. The light turned green. The car didn't move. The driver behind them sounded his horn, then went around on the left and continued on, and Wesley's driver kept watching the mirror, and Wesley still said nothing. The light turned red again, then green, then red. He sat through 3 changes of the traffic light at that intersection, with the door on the right still not fully closed, and he didn't turn his head toward the direction she had gone, and he didn't send anyone after her, and he didn't call Hollis. He could find her in 4 hours. He had already found her in 4 hours once before. That was precisely why he remained still. 3 weeks passed, and nothing happened. No call, no message, no black car parked at the end of 37th Street. No envelope in the mailbox, no stranger at her workplace. Delia waited for it through the first 7 days, and she hated that she was waiting, because waiting meant she had allowed for the possibility that someone might come, and, by the 10th day, she understood that no one was coming, and she hated the feeling that came with that understanding too. She went to work. She lost her shifts at Pemberton and Vale, or more precisely, her name disappeared from the schedule for 2 straight weeks without explanation, and Kestrel Doyle called her 3 times and never asked what had happened at the Peninsula Hotel, only whether she had eaten. She took extra shifts at the warehouse. She drove her mother to dialysis on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, helped her up and down 64 steps, and gave the same answer at the 31st. She was still $742 short. On the 22nd day, there was a letter from Northwestern Memorial Hospital in the mailbox. Delia opened it on the stairs because she couldn't wait until she reached the 3rd floor. It was 1 page long, and it said that the patient, Ruth Ann Rourke, had been reconsidered and placed on the kidney transplant waiting list, and it included a case number, a telephone number, and the name of a coordinator. There was no second envelope, No note enclosed, no name except her mother's in the hospitals. Delia sat on the stairs for about 10 minutes, then went upstairs, then read the letter 4 more times, and then she called. She didn't call to say thank you. She called to ask who had paid. The woman on the other end was very kind, like all the other kind people over the past 3 years, and she checked the file and said no one had. Delia said she didn't understand. The woman explained that this wasn't a matter of funding, that her mother's case had been reconsidered because the insurance company had withdrawn its original denial, and that the reason recorded in the system was the discovery of an error in the review process. Delia asked what kind of error. The woman said she didn't know. That was the only line she could see. Delia ended the call and sat in the kitchen looking at the pineapple magnet on the refrigerator door, understanding nothing. She found out 9 days later, not because she went looking. She was cleaning the 4th floor offices of the accounting firm on Wacker Drive early one Sunday morning, and someone had left a copy of the Chicago Tribune on a desk, folded open to the business section, and she picked it up to throw it away when her eyes caught a headline in the lower left corner. The article was 4 paragraphs long. It said that a Cook County court had agreed to hear a class action lawsuit against a major health insurance company, alleging bad faith denial of coverage, and that the plaintiffs included approximately 1,400 patients across Illinois, all of whom had been removed from organ transplant waiting lists during the previous 6 years under the same clause, the clause called treatment noncompliance. The 3rd paragraph said the case was being handled by a law firm on LaSalle Street. The 4th said that the cost of pursuing the lawsuit was being financed by a third party, that the party wasn't named in the court filings, and that the law firm had declined to comment. Delia read those 4 paragraphs 3 times while standing in the middle of an empty office at 7 o'clock on Sunday morning with a mop bucket beside her feet. Then she sat down in a chair that wasn't hers. For 9 days, she had believed that someone had made a phone call to someone else. She had prepared herself for that. She had been ready to hate it because she knew exactly what it would mean. It would mean that her mother was alive, because there was a man frightening enough to make someone change a line in a computer. And Delia had decided in the car that night that she wouldn't accept something like that, even if the price was her mother. That was what she had prepared herself for. She hadn't prepared for this. 1,400 people. She didn't know a single one of them. Not one of those 1,400 people knew her name, and not one of them had ever slept with anyone, or dropped anything, or redeemed anything at a pawn shop on 47th Street. They were simply 1,400 names shut out by the same line of text, and her mother was one of them, exactly one of them, no more than that. No one had changed a line in a computer for Ruth Ann Rourke. Someone had gone after the line itself, for everyone, and her mother's name was somewhere on that list of 1,400, probably in alphabetical order, probably between someone named Rodriguez and someone named Russo. And she would never know what number her mother was, and that was the entire point of it. And Delia understood that while sitting in a chair that wasn't hers at 7 o'clock in the morning, he could have saved her mother with one crooked phone call. He had more than enough power to do it. Instead, she realized he had already been financing this quiet, massive lawsuit for 18 months to protect thousands of strangers who had nothing. When he discovered her mother's name on that denial list 3 weeks ago, he didn't bypass the system just for her. He simply ordered his high-priced lawyers to double their efforts, pouring more resources into the case to crush the unfair clause once and for everyone. He had done it in total silence, never intending to use it as leverage, and had she not picked up that newspaper, she never would have known. Delia folded the newspaper. She didn't throw it away. She came the following Tuesday at 10:40 in the morning, wearing her work jacket and jeans, without an appointment, and it took her 40 minutes to find the address because Ardelan Holdings had nothing online, except a gray homepage and a main switchboard number. The building stood on East Wacker Drive overlooking the river. The lobby had high ceilings, pale stone, a long reception desk, and 3 chairs no one ever seemed to sit in. The person at the desk asked whether she had an appointment. Delia said no. The receptionist said she was sorry, and began the sentence Delia had heard enough times in her life to know exactly where it ended. And then a security guard standing about 10 feet away stepped 1 pace closer and looked at her, then stopped. He was around 50. his collar slightly tight, and he watched her for another 2 seconds before saying, "Delia." She looked up. "Frank." He laughed, the kind of laugh a person gave when an old piece of his life appeared in the wrong place, and he said, "Good Lord, I left the Drake Hotel almost 3 years ago." Delia said, "I know. You moved in the spring. You told me the pay was better here and you needed the money for your oldest daughter's college tuition." Frank stood there for a moment, then he said, "She is in her 3rd year now." Then he asked whom Delia had come to see. Delia said she had come to see Mr. Ardelan. The receptionist began to say something, and Frank raised one hand, not rudely, he simply raised it, and he said, "I will vouch for her." And he swiped his own card at the security gate, took her to the elevator, pressed the button for the 31st floor, and didn't ask her another question. She rode up 31 floors alone. Later, when she thought back on it, she didn't think about Wesley Ardelan. She thought about how she had been allowed into that building, not because of the man on the top floor, but because 4 years earlier, she had asked a security guard his name and remembered it. That was all the wealth she possessed in her life, and it turned out she could spend it. There was no secretary seated outside the office. The door was open. Wesley was standing at the window, and he turned when he heard her, and he didn't look surprised, nor did he make a point of looking unsurprised. Delia walked to his desk and placed the lighter on the wood. The sound of metal touching wood was very clear in that room. She said, "Whose was this?" Wesley looked at it. He said, "My father's." He gave her the name, Yannick Ardelan. Then he said, "I died in prison at Terre Haute when I was 19. He added nothing else. Delia said, "Then why did you give it to me?" And Wesley said, "I didn't." He stood about 2 paces from the desk and didn't come any closer. He said, "I left it behind." Then he continued, and this was the only sentence in the entire meeting during which his voice did something unusual. Not tremble, merely slow by half a beat. He said, "That was the first time in 10 years I had forgotten anything." Delia stood there and understood the sentence in a way he hadn't intended her to understand it, and she said nothing about that. She asked something else. She said, "The man at the Drake Hotel, that night. He came back and apologized to me in front of 4 people, and his face was white. What did you do to him?" Wesley didn't ask which man she meant. He said, "I bought his company 4 days later." Delia said nothing. Wesley continued, "Then I kept every employee, all 210 of them, and I didn't touch their wages or their health insurance." Then he said the final sentence, "And I fired exactly 1 person." Delia stood there for a long time. She looked at the lighter on the desk. She thought about the 1,400 names in a court file he wasn't permitted to sign, and she thought about 210 people who still had their jobs while 1 man didn't, and she thought about 4.5 months earlier, about a man standing in the corner of a room, holding a glass of water he never drank, watching her bow her head 40 degrees before 80 people, and not stepping forward. He hadn't saved her. He had waited until she finished bowing. Then he had gone into the hallway for 4 minutes, and she asked him the question she had been carrying inside herself since Sunday morning in the 4th floor office on Wacker Drive. The real question, the one she hadn't dared ask in the car because at the time she hadn't known enough to ask it. She said, "Did you do it for me, or because you couldn't bear to watch someone being forced to bow their head?" Wesley didn't answer. He looked at her, and there were many things he could have said. He could have said, "For you," and it would have been a beautiful answer and not entirely false. Or he could have given the other answer, and that wouldn't have been entirely false either. And he had lived 37 years and he didn't know. He truly didn't know. So he said nothing, and Delia stood in that office and watched him say nothing, and she understood that the silence was the answer, and that it was the most honest answer anyone had ever given her in her life. 11 days later, at 11 o'clock on a Friday night, Ruth Ann Rourke collapsed in the kitchen and couldn't get back on her feet, and Delia called an ambulance, and while she waited, her fingers found their way to a telephone number she had saved 3 weeks earlier and had never called. She pressed it. The phone rang once and a half. Then she hung up. She drove behind the ambulance to Northwestern Memorial in the 2009 Corolla, the gear shift still making its dry cracking sound every time she put it into second. She signed 3 admission forms by herself. She sat alone on a row of plastic chairs in the 4th floor hallway, both hands resting on her stomach, and she had spent enough time in hallways like that to know no one was coming, and she wasn't waiting for anyone. Wesley arrived at 12:20. He didn't ask anything. He didn't speak to the nurse. He didn't call anyone. He walked to that row of chairs and sat 3 seats away from her, and he didn't say a word. He remained there for 4 hours. Once, a nurse passed and asked whether they were family, and Delia said yes, and Wesley didn't turn his head. At 4 in the morning, Delia said, "You don't have to sit here." Wesley said, "I know." She stayed where she was for a while longer. Then she stood, walked 3 steps, sat beside him, and rested her head on his shoulder, and he didn't move, and neither of them said anything else until morning. 3 months later, Ruth Ann Rourke received a kidney transplant. The surgery lasted 5 hours and was successful, and she remained in the hospital for 9 days. And on the 4th day, she began apologizing to her daughter for being a burden, and Delia said, "Mom, please stop apologizing," and this time she smiled when she said it. Wesley and Corinne never saw each other again. In March, there was a 3-bedroom house in Evanston, 6 blocks from the lake, not a mansion, with a weathered wooden porch in the back. Delia was 8 months pregnant. The navy blue stethoscope was no longer in the bottom drawer. It hung from the hook beside the kitchen door, where people usually hung their keys, because she had returned to the University of Illinois Chicago for the spring semester, repeating her 3rd year, 3 days a week. Wesley said, "You don't have to do that." Delia said, "I know. That is exactly why I can." Hollis Vance came by one evening in March and sat at the kitchen table and said, "You can't have both." Wesley said, "I know." Then he said, "I am only trying to decide which one I leave behind for my child." Hollis asked nothing more, because there was no answer to that question in March of that year, and there wouldn't be one for many years, and both men sitting at that kitchen table knew it. The next morning, on the back porch with cold coffee in her hands, Delia asked, "Do you hate her?" Wesley said no. He said, "I forgave her a long time ago." Then he said, "What I hadn't forgiven until that night in the ballroom was the version of myself who believed he had to earn the right to be loved. The man who stood outside McCormick Place in the rain for 3 hours. He thought wet shoes and an empty wallet were the price he had to pay to be treated like a human being. Now I know. No one should ever have to pay that price." The 300 people who were inside the grand ballroom of the Peninsula Hotel that night would remember the plate of cake. They would remember the 7 glasses being set down. They would remember Corinne's face turning pale, and they would repeat the story for years at other parties. Not one of them would remember what had truly happened that evening, that a young woman wearing a name badge with no name had walked through 300 people and placed herself in front of him, not because she knew how much money he had, but because she believed he had nothing. Ilona had asked him a question when he was 24, whether he could make more silence than his father had, and it took him 13 years to understand that she hadn't been talking about keeping secrets. She had been talking about choosing what not to say, when saying it would force someone else to pay the price. This story leaves us with something very simple. A person's dignity doesn't live in the amount of money in their bank account. It doesn't live in what they wear when they enter a room, and it certainly doesn't live in what other people think of them. It lives in the way they treat those who can do absolutely nothing for them. Dignity is not a grand speech or a display of power. It is the quiet respect we offer to the unseen, and the silent strength we hold within ourselves when the world demands that we bow. Your silence in the face of humiliation is not defeat. It is simply a strength they cannot comprehend. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever been the person in the room whose name no one bothered to ask? Or have you ever been the person who forgot to ask someone else's name? Leave a comment below, because we truly want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. If this story touched you, please press like, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and subscribe to our channel to hear more moving stories every day. We wish everyone watching this video strong health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we will see you again in the next video.